Hello again! I'm Kate Sculpts, and today I decided to make Pooky from Moshi Monsters. I can imagine quite a few of you did actually play with Moshi Monsters as a kid, and I can tell you that I did, so I won't keep you waiting. Let's get into it! Now this here is Pooky. I actually did a poll on YouTube to see which Moshi Monster you wanted me to make, and Pooky came out on top. So, to start off, I rolled some foil into a little ball for the main body, and then I waxed some clay to get it nice and soft so it's mouldable enough for me to roll it out and put a nice layer of clay over the top of the foil. It is a bit lumpy right now, but I do add some more clay later to smooth it out, make it seem a bit nicer. All I'm doing here is just cutting off some excess clay so that I don't have too much on there. And then I go in and smooth it out to blend in all the seams. I start cutting some wire for the legs. I do have to change the position of them a few times because after a while I decide that I actually want Pooky to be sitting back a little bit, as if his eggshell is weighing him down a bit too much. Now, here's actually a bit of Moshi Monsters lore for you. Pooky doesn't own his eggshell. He takes it from a different one, like a different Moshi Monster. I don't know why. Apparently it's because he likes to pretend to be an astronaut or a racing car driver, which I love. I don't know how anyone could hate Pooky. Also, I have found the noise that Pooky makes, so I will play that for you, and brace yourself because it's a little bit jarring. I absolutely love Pooky. That's the best noise ever. Right, so to keep going on with the video, I added some more clay to the stomach to bulk it out, and my tools have a tendency of breaking off sometimes. And my cat comes in a lot, but pretty much I had to adjust the legs like I said. One of them I made slightly more upright, and then the other one slightly more down, more towards the floor, so that I can position it so it's sitting kind of on its butt and leaning back a little so that one leg is kind of going up into the air. I then roll another foil ball, making sure that the skewer actually goes through the head so that there's enough space for the eggshell to fit on later. And then I just wrap it in clay, put it in the head, and use some clay glue to make sure that it sticks in correctly. Of course, you can tell that the head is kind of in line with how big the body is, so later on I do add a bit more extra clay to it to bulk it out because obviously Pooky has quite a large head for such a small body. I use my rolling pin, whack it on the face so that there's enough space for the snout so that the front of the face isn't too long. I then poke in a hole into the butt so that I can fit in this piece of wire which is going to be the tail. I make it a little bit longer than I should do, but it's for the sake of keeping Pooky upright, as the head is going to be quite heavy later on. I roll out the tail decently thick and cut a slit down the middle so that I can fit around the wire. I make sure that it's quite thin at one end and then very thick at the other so that it kind of runs smoothly down the tail. And then I just blend it together using my fingers so that there's no seams. And then, as I usually do, I fill in the hole with some clay glue, stick the tail in, and then blend around it so that it blends nicely into the body. I then place on quite a big chunk of clay for the snout, and I do take off the front bit just because it's a little bit too thick, and Pooky only has a bit of a small snout, not an absolutely giant one. I did contemplate giving him little toes, but after I tried it, it looked absolutely horrific, so I decided to give him little stumps for feet that I would add little pads on later on. And then I began working on the arms, which are pretty much the exact same as the legs, except for the missing thigh beneath it. To place clay around a wire, all I do is just cut a slit down it and then wrap it around the wire so that it sits nicely on it. And then again, I add the little paw pads. When I started to make the eggshell, I cut 2 pieces of wire and curled them round into a dome shape and painstakingly attached them with some masking tape, followed by a wrap of foil on top. I then used the clay glue, brushing it over the surface so the clay would stick easily and not peel off later on, which it does have a tendency to do because the foil is quite smooth in this part. I rolled out some clay quite thick so that it would add enough weight but also make sure to cover all of those little foil bumps quite easily. Sometimes, when the clay is too thick to roll and it would hurt my hands too much, I actually start pulling it as if it's dough for a pizza. As I place the clay on top, I make sure that there's no air bubbles beneath it, otherwise that will make the clay crack when it's baking later on. I blend it as smooth as I can with the inside of the eggshell, and then I go in a little bit, roll it out, smooth the surface, and add some more clay so that it both bulks it out but also makes sure that there are no lumps that I don't want. I then go in with my little knife and cut all the way through the egg, including the foil, to make these cracks all along the bottom half of the eggshell. I try to make them look as natural as possible while also looking a little bit cartoony with how sharp they are. I kind of want it just to fit with the cracks on Pooky's eggshell, which there aren't many of. I just go back in and keep changing how thick or how thin the eggshell is so that it looks as even as possible along the top. Using my little sharp silicone tool, I make all the cracks along the body, stemming up from the little cracks at the bottom and even some at the top where it's just been damaged. I then make a hole for it to sit on the head, but I do change it later on to push it a bit more forward as it does cover the eyes. I also make the eggshell a little bit lower down so it sits higher up on the head. I then bend some wire into a circle, cover it with foil and bash it with my fist to start making the base. I do add clay on later, but we don't really see that because it's kind of irrelevant. Then making the eyes, I use my ball tools to make nice perfect circles, and also when adding these little lines of paint I use this silicone tool because it kind of globs on the paint a bit better than a paintbrush would, where I would just kind of pull the paint around. I then cave in Pooky's skull using this ball tool to make the eye sockets, and then I squeeze the eyes in. I make them look up, kind of at the eggshell, as it kind of does on the original model, but not really, just because he's going to be focusing on the eggshell, pulling him down to the ground. I then make the eyelids, but they're not really eyelids, it's just kind of a circle of clay around the eyes. He doesn't really have eyelids. Poor Pooky can't shut his eyes. And since the eyes are so big, I have to add a bit of extra clay around the eyes so that it doesn't look so gaunt. Then I work on his mouth. I just make a little hole, that's about it. And I don't give him his signature cheeky little smile because I want him to look a bit more panicked since he's going to be weighed down by his eggshell, almost pulled over to the ground. And I also attach his little nose on top as well. Then, using this horseshoe-shaped silicone tool, I press into the feet to make these little indents where the paw pads kind of are. It's pretty much the paw pads. I don't add clay, I take away clay, but pretty much. I then add these little lines down the tail. These are going to be the little bobbles that he has on the end of his tail. I kind of split them down the middle. Later on I do just add the circles themselves instead of adding the lines and then pushing them down in the middle to make them look like circles. I use my silicone tool for this instead of my fingers since they're quite small and delicate, and getting my fingers into those little gaps between would be quite difficult. I then chunk on some extra clay on top of his head so that the eggshell will be up a little bit higher. Yes. I then add these little lines of clay to start making these weird little scaly areas on the stomach, because on Pooky there is this little patch that he has on his stomach, so I decided to make them into these little lines. I put them on top of each other, kind of in layers, so that they'll have that little line underneath, and then it'll kind of look like little steps. Then I just quickly smooth it out, make sure that the edges look fine and aren't kind of blending too much into the main body. Then, with my tiny little ball tool, I gently dot it across the surface of the tail, just to create this little scaly pattern along it. Now I only do it in this little area back here to start with because I do want to attach it to the base before I do this, again with the clay glue, because otherwise I start smushing all the details as I'm going along. I then attach the skewers beneath his body and squish him onto the base. I do just use a little bit of extra clay in this one area just to make sure that he doesn't lift off and disattach from the base, even though the clay glue is there. And now that Pooky is on the base, all nice and secure, I went in again with my ball tool and did the rest of the body. It took quite a long time and it kind of made my hand just start to shake because I kind of had to shake it just to dot it anyways. It was a bit painful, but it's quite fun. Definitely looks quite scaly now. I then went in with my sharp silicone tool and dragged it along these little lines here to make lines in, again, just more texture. I then just attached these little balls of clay, didn't really care about them being flat or the shape or the size, just that they were going to be the stones and the terrain around Pooky. I smoothed them into the clay beneath. That clay is actually still super sculpey but firm, so it's just a little bit harder, and the only reason I used it is because I kind of started to run out of super sculpey. Then to create the kind of rocky texture, I used some foil and just smush it into the clay, and it makes it a bit sharp, a bit jagged, and looks like rocks. For the areas which I couldn't reach with the foil, I went in with this flat face tool and kind of just swiveled it in circles, and it pretty much made the exact same texture as well, but it did just take a bit more time, which is why I went with the foil in the first place. Then, using the clay glue, I attached the head right over Pooky's eyes. Luckily, it didn't get in the way. I also added some extra clay, as you can see, around it so that it would adhere to the face a bit better. And then I baked it, so it was all ready to paint. I went in with this kind of very lime green and I didn't like it, so I actually changed it later to kind of match Pooky's skin tone a bit. It looks more yellow later on, but just consider this as the base coat. That's the colour I'm talking about. I only really had to do 2 coats because of the colour I wanted to change, but also because on the first coat, all the paint kind of sunk into the little holes and made all the raised areas just not as covered in paint. Then I went in on the same colour as Pooky on the stomach area. I went a little bit darker so that I can change it later, so I can dry brush it and add the definition so that you can see all the lines that I added in earlier. I also painted the paw pads the same colour as the stomach too, even though that's not on Pooky, because he doesn't have paws. And then I started to paint the eggshell. I went in with this quite darkish grey. It's not very dark, I don't know what I'm on about. This grey, even though Pooky's shell is white, only because it's the base colour. I want all of this grey to kind of sink in to the lower parts of the eggshell, like all the cracks and crevices and some of the lumps. Just so that later, when I do add the white, you can still see a little bit of change in the colour, some lighter, some darker. I then went in with a slightly lighter colour, not white, but just quite yellow, and dry brushed over this bit here. And also dry brushed over the body. Not in the same colour, but just in a very slightly lighter green than the main body, just so that you can see the definition between the raised areas and the sunken in areas. I also made the top of each of these bumps lighter as well as the area kind of around the mouth and also the area around the eyes, just to make it look just a little bit different. Then I painted this nose this kind of dark red. Of course, like I usually do, later on I go in with a slightly lighter red and dry brush over the top, kind of like how I'm doing on the outside of the mouth here. I use the same colour on the mouth and the nose, only because on Pooky they are the same colour. The only reason I dry brush on the nose is so that it kind of looks like a little highlight on the top of it. And then I begin the eggshell colour. Now, you see I'm trying to use a paintbrush here, but then I go a little bit out of my comfort zone. I have used a sponge before, but not in this way. Instead of kind of dabbing it on, I swirl it on, kind of in this circular pattern. What this does actually just kind of buffs the paint onto the egg. And it actually makes it look really good and really matches kind of what the eggshell should look like. Then I use this little toothpick and scrape off all the paint that has covered the eyes this whole time. as well as then going in with this quite sharp tool that I have to get in all of the little crevices. Using a wet paintbrush, I wipe over the glass cabochon to grab all of the little paint crumbs. And then of course I do the exact same process for the other eye. For the stony base, I use this kind of dusty brown colour and paint it all over the base, including all of the little crevices under his butt as well. Then, using a very watered down, darker colour of paint, I brush it over the surface and use some tissue paper to collect up all that's left sitting on top of the surface, so that all of that is left sunken in to the cracks. And then of course I go over and dry brush an even lighter colour over the top of it. And then an even lighter colour on top of that. And then I coat it with this matte varnish just to keep all the paint safe and secure. And after that, Pooky is finished. I absolutely love how this came out. It kind of heals my inner child inside of me to know that I came back to Moshi Monsters after all these years when I'm much older than I used to be. I love how all the details came out in this, and Pooky was definitely a great choice to make into a bigger, more detailed sculpture. Even though I did take away the kind of cartoony style of it, I think some of it still snuck back into it. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you did enjoy the video, consider leaving a like, and if you want to see more like this in the future, you could also subscribe. Have a great day and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye bye!